Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Quiet Coronation of Hugh Capet. In the late 10th century, the landscape of what we now call France was a patchwork of territories, duchies, and counties, each dominated by powerful lords whose authority often rivaled that of the king himself. The Carolingian dynasty, once a source of unity and authority, had weakened, leaving behind a kingdom fragmented both politically and socially. Within this fractured world, the seeds of a new dynasty were quietly taking root. The Capetians, a relatively obscure noble family from the Isle de France, were on the cusp of an unexpected rise. Central to this ascent was Hugh Capet, a man whose life and eventual coronation in 987 were not marked by dramatic battlefields or legendary feats, but rather by careful navigation of the slow-moving machinery of medieval politics. Hugh Capet was born around 940 into the Robertian family, a lineage with ties to earlier Carolingian rulers, though by the time of Hugh's life, they were far from being at the center of power. His father, Hugh the Great, held the title of Duke of the Franks, a position that gave him substantial influence in the northern regions around Paris. Hugh the Great was a cautious man who knew the limits of his power. He balanced his authority with the ambitions of other nobles, often acting more as a mediator than a conqueror. Young Hugh inherited both his father's titles and his political acumen, but he would need more than inherited status to navigate a kingdom in decline. In these years, kingship was less about absolute authority and more about recognition and negotiation. The king, especially one like the late Carolingian monarchs, ruled less as a solitary sovereign and more as a figurehead whose power depended on the loyalty of powerful vassals. It was a world where the line between influence and irrelevance was thin, and where everyday details like who collected the local tolls, who controlled the forests, or which monastery a lord supported could tip the scales of political authority. Hugh Capet's path to kingship was rooted in understanding and exploiting these small but critical levers of power. By the 970s, Hugh had become Count of Paris, a title that placed him at the heart of the kingdom's political and religious life. Paris, though far from the bustling metropolis it would later become, was strategically situated along the Seine River, a critical artery for trade and travel. Control over Paris meant not only access to economic resources, but also proximity to the ecclesiastical authorities who played a decisive role in legitimizing kingship. Hugh's ability to maintain strong ties with the bishops and abbots around Paris was crucial. In an era when religious endorsement could elevate a man to kingship or doom him to obscurity, these relationships were far from trivial. The late 10th century was also a period marked by the quiet persistence of threats. Viking raids, while less intense than in previous decades, still lingered in the collective memory of northern France. Local lords maintained fortified positions, often constructing timber and earth defenses that could repel occasional raiders. Hugh, inheriting his father's estates, managed these defenses with meticulous care, overseeing the upkeep of fortifications and ensuring the loyalty of his vassals through regular visits, gifts, and confirmations of privileges. These activities, though mundane by modern standards, were essential to projecting authority. In this sense, Hugh's rise was less the product of spectacular heroism than of disciplined administration and the cultivation of trust qualities that history tends to overlook, but which his contemporaries would have noticed with acute interest. Another subtle yet important element of Hugh's growing influence was his reputation for stability. In a world of frequent rebellions and violent disputes among nobles, a ruler who could promise predictability and continuity became increasingly valuable. Hugh's approach to governance emphasized incremental gains rather than dramatic upheaval. He negotiated carefully with other powerful families, secured alliances through marriages and land grants, and avoided unnecessary conflicts. While these actions might seem ordinary, they created a foundation for the broader political shift that would eventually elevate him to the throne. It was not the clang of swords, but the meticulous recording of agreements, the administration of lands, and the quiet enforcement of justice that built his credibility. When King Louis V, the last Carolingian monarch, died childless in 987, the question of succession became urgent and delicate. Various noble factions could have seized the opportunity to assert their claims, potentially plunging the kingdom into chaos. Yet Hugh Capet emerged as the candidate acceptable to the majority of the leading nobles. The reasons were as practical as they were political. Hugh had long cultivated relationships across the northern territories. He controlled key lands around Paris, and he had proven himself a reliable mediator rather than a provocative aggressor. Importantly, his selection also reflected a consensus among the clergy. The Archbishop of Reims, a powerful figure in legitimizing kings, supported Hugh, further smoothing the path for his election. Hugh's coronation was far from a grand spectacle by modern standards. It took place in Noyon, a location chosen for its symbolic and practical significance rather than for its capacity to impress. Contemporary records suggest a ceremony marked more by ritual and religious observance than by ostentation. Hugh was anointed, given the symbols of kingship, and recognized by his peers as the new sovereign. For those outside the immediate circle of nobility and clergy, the event may have appeared quiet, almost uneventful. Yet the implications were profound. By becoming king, Hugh Capet initiated a line of succession that would endure for centuries, laying the foundations of a monarchy that would eventually become the most enduring in European history. It is worth noting that Hugh's accession was not universally celebrated. Some regional lords viewed his elevation with suspicion, concerned about the concentration of authority in a single family. Others doubted whether he could maintain control over the fractious nobles who held the real power in their territories. Unlike later kings who would expand their authority through decisive wars or legislative acts, Hugh's strength lay in his reputation for measured judgment and his capacity to navigate the slow, intricate web of feudal obligations. His challenge was not to defeat enemies outright, but to manage relationships, ensure loyalty, and preserve a delicate balance of power that had been eroding for decades. Hugh Capet's early reign also reminds us of the importance of seemingly minor details in shaping history. The upkeep of estates, the management of local markets, the granting of privileges to monasteries, all of these mundane actions were threads in a larger tapestry. They reinforced his legitimacy, earned the support of local communities, and created the perception of a stable and capable ruler. In the long run, these quiet efforts mattered as much as battlefield victories would in later centuries, because they allowed the Capetians to consolidate authority gradually without provoking widespread rebellion. By the end of Section 1, Hugh Capet had become king, but many questions remained unresolved. Could this relatively small and cautious noble family maintain its authority over generations? Would Hugh's methods of careful negotiation and quiet governance be enough to unify a fragmented kingdom, or would the pressures of regional power struggles eventually overwhelm his strategy? The coronation itself marked a beginning rather than a conclusion, a turning point in a kingdom still defined by slow, incremental shifts in power and the unpredictable influence of everyday human decisions. As you reflect on this quiet but significant transition, it becomes clear that history is often shaped not by dramatic battles or legendary heroes, but by patient, deliberate actions taken over years. Hugh Capet's ascent reminds us that power in the medieval world was as much about persistence, prudence, and perception as it was about inherited titles. And yet, even after securing the throne, the question lingered: how would this modest count turn kingship into a lasting dynasty? Following his coronation in 987, Hugh Capet faced the subtle but persistent challenge of ruling a kingdom that was far from unified. Unlike later monarchs who could rely on standing armies, professional bureaucracies, or centralized tax systems. Hugh's power rested primarily on personal relationships, local influence, and the loyalty or at least the tolerance of other nobles. The Carolingian kings he succeeded had long depended on ritual authority and symbolic legitimacy, yet the real day-to-day power lay in the hands of regional counts, dukes, and bishops. For Hugh, understanding and navigating these dynamics was crucial, and much of his early reign was spent in quiet, incremental work to reinforce the authority he had just claimed. One of Hugh's most pressing concerns was maintaining control over the Ile-de-France, the heartland of his family's holdings. This region, though smaller than the vast Carolingian territories of earlier centuries, was strategically vital. It encompassed Paris and several surrounding towns and monasteries that provided both revenue and symbolic legitimacy. Securing loyalty here required a combination of diplomacy, oversight, and careful attention to mundane administrative tasks. Hugh ensured that tolls on river trade along the Seine were collected consistently, that disputes over farmland were mediated before escalating into violence, and that local vassals were regularly summoned to swear fealty. Each of these actions, while seemingly routine, reinforced the perception that the king was present, competent, and dependable, a crucial foundation for authority in a world where power was often contested through both open rebellion and quiet resistance. Beyond his immediate holdings, Hugh had to navigate relationships with other regional powers. The kingdom was a patchwork of semi-autonomous territories, including Normandy to the north, Aquitaine to the southwest, and Burgundy to the east. Many of these regions were ruled by families whose influence rivaled, or even exceeded, that of the king. Hugh's approach was cautious but deliberate. He avoided direct confrontation unless absolutely necessary and relied on alliances, marriages, and mutual obligations to extend his influence. By arranging strategic marriages for himself and his children, he created bonds that could reinforce political loyalty across generations. These arrangements were not dramatic military campaigns, but quiet, careful moves, calculated over months and years, reflecting the slow rhythm of medieval politics. Hugh also understood the importance of religious support in consolidating power. The church was more than a spiritual authority. It was an institution with significant landholdings, economic influence, and social reach. Bishops and abbots could legitimize a ruler, mobilize local populations, and provide moral authority that ordinary nobles could not. Hugh maintained close relationships with key ecclesiastical figures, particularly the Archbishop of Reims, whose blessing had been instrumental in his coronation. He frequently granted privileges to monasteries, funded the construction and repair of churches, and involved clerics in mediating disputes among the nobility. These efforts, while appearing mundane, created networks of influence that bolstered his authority quietly but effectively. In many ways, the success of his kingship depended less on military prowess and more on the careful cultivation of respect and loyalty within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Economics also played a subtle but central role in Hugh's consolidation of power. Unlike modern states with centralized taxation, medieval kings relied on a patchwork of tolls, rents, and feudal dues. Hugh worked to ensure that these revenues were collected reliably, using the proceeds to maintain his household, fund religious patronage, and occasionally support loyal vassals. The details mattered. Even minor disruptions in local markets or failures to enforce agreements could weaken perception of royal authority. Hugh's attentiveness to these everyday administrative matters earned him the reputation of a competent ruler, even if his actions rarely inspired dramatic chronicles. For his contemporaries, the steady, predictable exercise of power could be more reassuring and more influential than the fleeting glory of battlefield victories. Despite these successes, Hugh's reign was not without tension. Some powerful nobles remained wary of his authority, and the kingdom as a whole was still deeply decentralized. A count in the south might treat royal directives as suggestions rather than commands, and the enforcement of loyalty often required a delicate mixture of negotiation, reward, and threat. Hugh's approach was subtle. He emphasized compromise and mediation, stepping in only when disputes threatened broader stability. Over time, this approach created a reputation for the king as a stabilizing figure, a man whose influence grew quietly, rooted in respect and strategic patience rather than in overt displays of force. The personal habits and character of Hugh Capet also contributed to his ability to rule effectively. He was known for his cautious temperament, his methodical attention to detail, and his willingness to listen to counsel. While later kings might have relied on charisma or decisive action, Hugh relied on steadiness, predictability, and the careful accumulation of authority. He spent hours overseeing the management of his estates, resolving disputes among vassals, and attending to the minutiae of court life. These actions might seem dull in isolation, yet they collectively reinforced the legitimacy of the monarchy and allowed him to project influence across a fragmented realm. An interesting aspect of Hugh's early reign is the contrast between perception and reality. To the casual observer, the kingdom might have appeared static, uneventful, and even mundane. Yet beneath this surface, subtle forces were at work. Networks of loyalty were forming, economic systems were stabilizing, and relationships with the church and regional lords were being carefully nurtured. Hugh's genius lay not in dramatic gestures, but in understanding the cumulative power of routine, discipline, and negotiation. By the time his reign had matured, he had transformed what might have seemed a weak and fragmented kingship into a foundation capable of supporting centuries of dynastic continuity. Hugh also had to contend with the broader context of European politics. The Holy Roman Empire, England, and various neighboring principalities were all entities whose interests intersected with those of the French crown. While Hugh did not wage large-scale wars against these powers, his diplomacy ensured that France remained stable and avoided major conflicts during his reign. He carefully monitored treaties, supported loyal vassals who controlled strategic border territories, and intervened selectively when the kingdom's interests were threatened. Again, the work was incremental, largely invisible, and seemingly uneventful, but it created the perception of a kingdom under capable guidance. Yet even as Hugh Capet solidified his authority in these quiet, administrative ways, questions lingered. Could the Capetian dynasty endure beyond his own reign? Would the careful network of alliances, loyalties, and ecclesiastical support survive when tested by ambitious heirs or restive nobles? Hugh's life and governance showed that kingship could be built gradually, almost imperceptibly, but the resilience of such a system remained unproven. The coronation of Hugh Capet had marked the beginning of a dynasty, but the true test of its longevity would come in the decades following his death, when the fragility of feudal obligations, the unpredictability of noble ambition, and the weight of everyday governance would be fully revealed. The early reign of Hugh Capet teaches us that history is often shaped in quiet, almost invisible ways. The daily administration of lands, the careful negotiation of loyalty, the strategic granting of favors and privileges, all of these boring actions accumulated to create a foundation that allowed the Capetian dynasty to endure for centuries. In reflecting on this period, we are reminded that power is not always about grand gestures or decisive battles. It is often a product of patience, prudence, and the persistent attention to detail. And yet, even with these efforts, one cannot help but wonder, could Hugh Capet's successors maintain the balance he had so carefully constructed, or would the pressures of ambition, rebellion, and circumstance eventually expose cracks in the foundation of the new dynasty? The answers would unfold slowly, in the quiet, incremental shifts that define much of medieval history. Hugh Capet passed away in 996, after nearly a decade of kingship that had, on the surface, seemed quiet, unremarkable, and almost routine. Yet in retrospect, This decade represented a crucial turning point for the Kingdom of France. Hugh's reign demonstrated that monarchy could survive and even strengthen through patience, careful diplomacy, and meticulous attention to the details of governance. Unlike the kings of legend whose victories were celebrated in song and story, Hugh's triumph lay in stability, a subtle but profound achievement in a fractured and volatile medieval landscape. The immediate legacy of Hugh's reign was political continuity. Unlike many of his predecessors who had faced succession crises or violent upheavals upon death, Hugh ensured a smooth transition to his son, Robert II, later known as Robert the Pious. This succession was not guaranteed. The feudal system was notoriously unpredictable, and the loyalty of nobles could not be commanded outright. Yet through careful cultivation of relationships and the embedding of ecclesiastical support, Hugh created conditions where his heirs could inherit both land and legitimacy without plunging the kingdom into civil war. In a period when dynasties often rose and fell within a generation, this accomplishment was remarkable. The Capetian Dynasty, founded by Hugh, also introduced a model of kingship that differed from the Carolingians. Where the Carolingians had relied on inherited authority and symbolic grandeur, Hugh's approach emphasized incremental consolidation, grounded in practical governance and negotiation. This model allowed the monarchy to expand its influence gradually, establishing authority over powerful regional lords while avoiding costly conflicts. Over the subsequent centuries, this approach would become a defining characteristic of Capetian rule, a steady, enduring accumulation of power rather than reliance on immediate, dramatic triumphs. Beyond the political sphere, Hugh's reign demonstrated the significance of ordinary, everyday actions in the shaping of history. His attentiveness to toll collection along the Seine, mediation of disputes among vassals, and careful oversight of estates may appear mundane by modern standards, yet these acts directly reinforced his legitimacy and authority. Medieval chroniclers, often more interested in battles and extraordinary events, gave little attention to such routines. But from a historical perspective, these boring details were the foundation upon which the Capetians built a dynasty capable of lasting for centuries. Hugh's story is a reminder that history often unfolds in the quiet accumulation of small acts, rather than in spectacular, headline-making moments. Hugh's careful diplomacy extended beyond internal politics. He maintained relationships with neighboring powers such as the Holy Roman Empire, England, and smaller principalities. Through these interactions, he avoided unnecessary conflicts while subtly asserting France's presence in the broader European context. Hugh's foreign policy was neither flamboyant nor aggressive. It relied on prudence, observation, and timing. His ability to maintain the kingdom's stability while navigating complex external pressures reinforced the notion that effective kingship could be exercised through strategy and foresight rather than sheer force. Yet Hugh's reign also left unresolved questions that would shape the future of France. While he had created a stable foundation, he had not expanded royal authority significantly beyond his inherited territories. The regional lords remained powerful, and the kingdom's political cohesion was fragile, dependent on personal relationships and the continuation of his policies by his heirs. Robert II would inherit a throne secure in name but still fragile in practice, facing the challenge of extending royal influence further and consolidating a kingdom that remained, in many ways, a mosaic of semi-independent territories. The social and economic context of Hugh's reign is equally important. He ruled over a largely agrarian society, where peasants, labor, and local productivity sustained both noble and royal households. Markets, tolls, and rural management may seem mundane, yet these details underpin the monarchy's power. Hugh's attention to such matters ensured that the machinery of the kingdom functioned smoothly, providing resources and stability that allowed him to focus on long-term governance rather than crisis management. The Capetian model, which he exemplified, demonstrated the quiet interdependence between ruler and the daily lives of ordinary subjects, whose productivity, loyalty, and obedience formed the unseen backbone of authority. Perhaps most enduring is the symbolic aspect of Hugh Capet's kingship. By successfully establishing a dynasty that would endure for centuries, Hugh transformed the perception of the monarchy itself. His coronation and the years that followed marked the transition from a fragile, ceremonial kingship to a foundation for enduring political authority. In a society deeply attuned to ritual and legitimacy, Hugh's methodical accumulation of influence, backed by ecclesiastical sanction and grounded in careful administration, redefined what it meant to be king in France. His dynasty would eventually oversee profound transformations, from territorial consolidation to cultural flourishing. Yet all of this traces its roots to the patient, meticulous rule of a king whose quiet actions reshaped the kingdom's future. It is important to appreciate the paradox of Hugh Capet's success. He is remembered less for decisive battles, brilliant speeches, or dramatic crises than for his careful management of routine, his cultivation of loyalty, and his attention to ordinary governance. These are not the qualities that make headlines in popular history, yet they are precisely what allowed the Capetians to endure. Hugh's reign teaches that longevity in leadership often depends on prudence, patience, and the careful orchestration of countless small, interrelated actions, an approach that remains relevant even in modern conceptions of political strategy. As we reflect on Hugh Capet's reign, a broader lesson emerges about the nature of historical change. The rise of the Capetian dynasty was not inevitable. It was the product of subtle choices, patient observation, and the careful management of human relationships over time. The dynasty's endurance illustrates how stability, rather than spectacle, can shape history in profound ways. Hugh's quiet reign laid the foundation for what would become one of Europe's longest-lasting dynasties, demonstrating that even seemingly mundane details market oversight, estate management, mediation of disputes can echo across centuries when carefully executed. And yet, even with the benefit of hindsight, one must wonder, could any other ruler have replicated Hugh's approach? Was his success a product of his unique temperament and circumstance, or could the same patient consolidation have been achieved by others? Hugh Capet's reign invites us to consider the invisible threads that connect daily governance, human relationships, and long-term historical outcomes. The dynasty he founded would eventually shape the course of French history for centuries. But the quiet, deliberate work that made this possible often goes unnoticed, a reminder that history is made as much in the slow accumulation of small acts as in the dramatic events that dominate chronicles. Story 2: The Early Capetian Court. Life in Paris. At the close of the 10th century, Paris was not the bustling metropolis it would one day become. Instead, it was a modest city, a cluster of wooden homes and stone churches nestled along the winding banks of the Seine. Its streets were narrow, muddy, and often crowded with animals, carts, and vendors. Yet despite its humble size, Paris held a unique importance. It was the center of the Capetian family's power, a symbolic heart of the newly crowned kingdom, and a hub where political, religious, and economic threads converged. The life of the early Capetian court revolved around this city, its rhythm defined by routine, ritual, and the constant attention required to maintain authority in a fragmented realm. The court itself was a far cry from the opulence one might imagine when thinking of medieval kings. Hugh Capet's household consisted of a relatively small group of nobles, clerics, and servants, each with defined roles in the administration of his lands. The king's immediate advisors included chamberlains, stewards, and constables, responsible for managing everything from finances to the king's personal safety. Clergy, often abbots or bishops, played a central role not only in spiritual matters, but also in mediating disputes, drafting charters, and providing counsel on political strategy. The division of labor was precise. reflecting the Capetian emphasis on order and routine, and the smooth operation of the court depended on the careful execution of mundane tasks as much as on ceremonial appearances. Daily life at the court was highly structured. Hugh Capet's day began with routine prayers and the reading of charters or correspondence, followed by meetings with advisors to resolve disputes or confirm obligations. The king might then review the management of his estates, inspect accounts of tolls collected along the Seine, or consider petitions from local lords seeking favor or adjudication. Meals were simple by modern standards, consisting of bread, meat, and vegetables when available, accompanied by ale or watered wine. Even the act of eating was often formalized, with certain nobles attending at specific times, seating arrangements reflecting rank and precedence, and etiquette carefully observed to prevent disputes or offense. In this environment, the minutiae of daily life were inseparable from political reality. A poorly managed meal or mishandled petition could damage authority, while attentiveness to small matters reinforced the perception of competence. Religious observance shaped the rhythm of court life in profound ways. Hugh Capet's court maintained close ties with nearby monasteries and churches, whose abbots and priests frequently visited to perform services, advise the king, and participate in ceremonial events. Prayer and ritual were not merely spiritual exercises. They were acts of governance, reinforcing the king's legitimacy and publicly demonstrating the divine sanction of his rule. The early morning bells of local churches punctuated the day, calling both court and commoners alike to reflection and observance. Feast days, fasts, and religious festivals structured social life, providing the court with both ceremonial spectacle and opportunities to strengthen alliances with powerful ecclesiastical figures. While the court revolved around administration and ritual, it also functioned as a center of information. Paris was a hub for merchants, envoys, and travelers, bringing news from neighboring regions and beyond. Intelligence about the movements of vassals, economic disruptions, or potential rebellions allowed the Capetians to respond preemptively rather than reactively. In an era without a standing army or formal bureaucracy, knowledge was power, and the early Capetian court was as much an information center as it was a residence. Courtiers devoted time to compiling reports, noting trends in trade or agriculture, and keeping track of obligations owed by local lords, all contributing to a slow, steady consolidation of influence. Security was a constant, if understated, concern. Paris in the late 10th century was protected by modest fortifications, earthen walls, wooden palisades, and the occasional stone keep. These defenses were designed to repel opportunistic raiders rather than withstand prolonged sieges. The king relied on loyal vassals and his household knights to maintain order, patrol the surrounding lands, and enforce justice. Even within the court, vigilance was necessary. Disputes among nobles could erupt into violence, and the loyalty of servants and lesser officials was essential to prevent theft or mismanagement. Hugh Capet's attentiveness to these practical matters reflected his understanding that authority in this period depended not on grandeur, but on competence and control over small, everyday realities. The social life of the court, while less dramatic than battles or grand feasts, had its own rhythm of hierarchy and obligation. Nobles were expected to demonstrate loyalty through attendance, service, and adherence to etiquette. Minor acts bowing correctly, addressing the king properly, or observing the sequence of gift exchanges reinforced a system of respect and reinforced bonds of allegiance. Marriages and betrothals were negotiated at court, often in extended ceremonies that combined political maneuvering with ritual observance. Children of the nobility were educated in basic literacy, religious observance, and the practical skills of estate management, reflecting the court's role as a training ground for the next generation of leaders. In this sense, even the most mundane aspects of daily life, meal arrangements, seating orders, and gift exchanges served as mechanisms for governance, preserving both authority and social order. The economic realities of Paris also shaped court life. The Seine provided a conduit for trade, allowing merchants to transport goods such as grain, wine, and timber, which sustained both the city and the royal household. Markets and tolls required constant oversight. The collection of dues was both a source of revenue and a demonstration of the king's authority. Even minor disruptions, failed harvests, delayed shipments, or disputes over tolls could ripple outward, affecting both political relationships and the perception of royal competence. Hugh Capet and his advisors treated these issues seriously, understanding that the seemingly trivial details of local commerce could have consequences for stability and loyalty. Perhaps one of the most subtle aspects of court life was the cultivation of loyalty through attention to personal relationships. Hugh Capet's interactions with nobles, clerics, and servants were deliberate, measured, and aimed at creating a sense of reliability. He distributed gifts, confirmed privileges, and mediated conflicts with a careful balance of generosity and restraint. This cultivation of goodwill was not flashy. It was slow, almost imperceptible, yet it strengthened the bonds that would support his reign and, eventually, the broader Capetian dynasty. In a society where authority was personal rather than institutional, these relationships were critical, and the king's attention to them became a defining feature of his rule. Even the architecture and physical layout of Paris reflected the priorities of the early Capetian court. Modest palaces, fortified residences, and religious structures dominated the landscape, designed to serve both practical and symbolic purposes. Stone churches projected permanence and divine favor. Palaces and keeps demonstrated stability and authority. Bridges and roads facilitated trade and movement. In each case, the physical environment reinforced the functions of governance, signaling the king's presence and the interconnectedness of religious, economic, and political life. By the end of Section 1, it becomes clear that the Capetian court was a microcosm of the kingdom itself, a place where careful attention to everyday details, relationships, and routines allowed the monarchy to exert influence over a fragmented realm. While there were no dramatic battles or legendary feats of heroism, the subtle, methodical work performed within Paris laid the foundation for the dynasty's endurance. Yet questions remained. Could the Capetians continue to extend their authority beyond Paris and the Île-de-France? Would the slow, incremental methods of governance prove sufficient to manage ambitious nobles and an increasingly complex kingdom? The answers would emerge only over the decades that followed, as the dynasty expanded its reach and tested the durability of its quiet foundations. By the late 10th century, the Capetian court in Paris was more than a residence. It had become the operational heart of a kingdom still very much in the process of defining itself. Hugh Capet, while careful and deliberate, understood that authority was not simply granted by coronation. It had to be exercised, tested, and observed by those whose support was crucial. Paris, as both symbolic center and practical hub, allowed him to navigate the complex interplay of politics, ritual, and social hierarchy that characterized early medieval kingship. One of the most persistent challenges for Hugh was maintaining the loyalty of regional lords. Many of these nobles controlled territories that were geographically distant from the Île-de-France, and their power often rivaled that of the king. Direct confrontation was risky, potentially leading to open rebellion or the erosion of alliances. Instead, Hugh relied on negotiation, patronage, and subtle assertion of influence. Lords were summoned to Paris for court sessions, where disputes were mediated and fealty reaffirmed. Attendance was expected, but it also provided opportunities for the king to cultivate personal relationships, offer favors, or subtly remind the lords of the benefits of royal allegiance. In this way, the court functioned as a center of both governance and diplomacy, its routine proceedings carrying profound political weight. Religious observance remained a cornerstone of authority. Hugh's court regularly hosted bishops, abbots and monks who performed mass, advised on legal matters, and participated in ceremonial events. The king's presence at religious functions reinforced the perception that his rule was divinely sanctioned. Feasts and festivals, particularly those aligned with the liturgical calendar, were both social and political events. They allowed the king to distribute gifts, confirm privileges, and demonstrate generosity while simultaneously reinforcing social hierarchies. Even the careful planning of seating arrangements during these events mattered. Precedence and visibility sent subtle signals about loyalty, status, and royal favor. By attending closely to these rituals, Hugh ensured that his authority was recognized and respected by both nobles and clergy. The court also operated as an administrative hub. Daily governance required constant attention to matters that modern observers might consider trivial, reviewing charters, confirming land grants, resolving disputes over boundaries, and overseeing tolls and markets. While these actions lacked the drama of battlefield conquests, they were essential to reinforcing the perception of competence and maintaining the delicate balance of feudal obligations. Each resolved dispute, each properly collected toll, and each confirmed grant of privilege strengthened the network of loyalty that allowed Hugh to rule effectively over territories that were, in practice, semi-autonomous. Economic oversight was closely tied to governance. Paris sat along the Seine, a critical artery for trade, and the king relied on the consistent collection of tolls and dues to fund his household and maintain influence over local lords. Markets were monitored for fairness, disputes among merchants mediated, and agricultural production carefully observed. Even small disruptions could have political repercussions. A poorly managed toll, a disrupted grain supply, or a dispute among farmers could reduce the perception of royal authority. Hugh's court treated these practical concerns with the same seriousness as more conspicuous political matters, recognizing that stable administration underpinned legitimacy. The court also served as a center for information and intelligence. Envoys, merchants, and travelers brought news from across the kingdom and beyond, allowing Hugh to monitor potential unrest, shifts in alliances, or external threats. In an era without centralized communication systems or standing armies, timely information was a key asset. By gathering and interpreting reports from multiple sources, the king and his advisors could anticipate challenges before they escalated, a strategy that reinforced the perception of competence and control. Even seemingly minor details such as reports of a poor harvest in Burgundy or rumors of a noble's dissatisfaction in Normandy could inform policy decisions that prevented crises from emerging. Socially, the court was a theater of obligation and hierarchy. Nobles, clerics, and servants each understood their roles, and small gestures of respect and attentiveness were significant. Bowing correctly, offering gifts at appropriate times, and following ceremonial protocols were all part of reinforcing authority. Children of noble families were educated at court in practical skills, literacy, and religious observance, preparing them to uphold the values and social order of the kingdom. Marriages and alliances were carefully negotiated within the court, combining personal, political, and economic considerations. In these ways, the court functioned not only as a residence and administrative center, but also as an incubator for the norms and practices that would sustain the Capetian Dynasty. The physical space of Paris and the court itself reinforced authority. Fortified residences, stone churches, and bridges served both practical and symbolic purposes. Fortifications protected the king and his household, while churches projected divine favor. Bridges and roads facilitated trade and movement, linking the Capetian heartland with surrounding regions. Even mundane features of the urban landscape, market squares, toll stations, and river crossings, became sites where royal authority could be asserted and observed. In essence, the city and its infrastructure were extensions of the king's influence, tangible manifestations of governance in the everyday lives of subjects. Despite these advantages, challenges remained. Not all lords were loyal, and the kingdom's authority was still fragile beyond Paris and the Isle de France. Hugh's careful management could maintain stability for the moment, but the durability of his authority depended on continued attentiveness and the willingness of successors to maintain the networks he had cultivated. In other words, the Capetian model relied on patience, prudence, and the accumulation of small acts that reinforced loyalty and legitimacy. While effective, it was also vulnerable to neglect, mismanagement, or the ambitions of powerful vassals. Even as Hugh navigated these complexities, the rhythms of court life, ritual, administration, diplomacy, and personal relationship building shaped the political and social order in ways that would endure for generations. The Capetian court in Paris became a template for governance, a center of authority where quiet, methodical attention to everyday matters reinforced legitimacy and allowed for the slow expansion of influence. The king's ability to balance ceremony, administration, and personal relationships ensured that the court functioned as both a practical center of government and a symbol of stability. By the end of Section 2, the Capetian court in Paris had proven itself more than a residence. It had become the linchpin of the dynasty's early authority. Yet the story remained incomplete. Could the Capetians extend their influence beyond the capital and truly unify a fragmented kingdom? Would the careful, incremental methods of governance that worked within Paris prove effective in regions distant from the king's direct oversight? And how would the dynamics of the court evolve as subsequent generations of Capetians faced new challenges, ambitions, and opportunities? The answers would unfold gradually, as the dynasty matured and the kingdom grew more complex, guided by the quiet lessons of Hugh Capet's early reign. By the turn of the 11th century, the Capetian court in Paris had grown into more than just the residence of Hugh Capet and his household. It had become the practical and symbolic heart of a fledgling monarchy. What began as a modest collection of timber houses, stone churches, and administrative offices had evolved into a center where governance, ritual, and social hierarchy intertwined, forming the blueprint for a dynasty that would endure for centuries. Yet this transformation was neither immediate nor dramatic. It was the product of careful attention, daily routines, and the quiet exercise of authority that often went unnoticed in contemporary chronicles. Hugh Capet's careful cultivation of the court set the tone for his successors. Robert II, known as Robert the Pious, inherited not only the kingship, but also the institutional and social framework that allowed the monarchy to function with authority in an era of fragmented power. The court had demonstrated the importance of integrating administration with ritual, diplomacy with ceremony, and social hierarchy with personal relationships. These elements would define Capetian governance, creating a model that relied less on sudden displays of force than on the steady accumulation of influence and legitimacy. In this sense, the Capetian court was not merely a residence, it was a laboratory for the art of kingship. One of the key achievements of the early court was its ability to centralize authority incrementally without provoking widespread rebellion. By carefully managing relations with regional lords, reinforcing ecclesiastical support, and attending to the details of daily governance, Hugh Capet created a perception of competence and reliability. This perception mattered immensely in a feudal society, where authority was personal and contingent upon the recognition of peers and subjects alike. Even small successes, resolving disputes between vassals, ensuring consistent toll collection along the Seine, or granting privileges to loyal allies served as cumulative demonstrations of royal presence and effectiveness. The court also functioned as a training ground for the next generation of leaders. Young nobles and clerics, educated in the routines of governance, the subtleties of protocol, and the expectations of loyalty, learned the skills necessary to sustain the monarchy. Through observation and participation, they absorbed the principles of administration, diplomacy, and ritual that would allow them to navigate the challenges of a decentralized kingdom. This emphasis on education and apprenticeship ensured that the Capetian model of kingship could be transmitted across generations, embedding stability into the very fabric of the dynasty. Religious observance remained central to the court's authority. Monks, abbots, and bishops were not mere spiritual advisors. They were essential collaborators in governance, mediators in disputes, and legitimizers of royal power. Through careful patronage of religious institutions, whether by funding the repair of churches, confirming monastic privileges, or attending Mass, the Capetian court reinforced the sacred dimension of kingship. The rituals performed within Parisian churches, the ceremonial procession of the king, and the public recognition of clerical authority all served to intertwine spiritual and temporal power, enhancing the monarchy's legitimacy in ways that were subtle yet enduring. Economic and administrative oversight continued to be a defining feature of the court. The Seine, the surrounding farmlands, and local markets provided both the material sustenance for the monarchy and a tangible demonstration of authority. Careful monitoring of trade, the collection of tolls, and the adjudication of disputes all reflected the court's attention to the mundane but critical aspects of governance. The Capetians understood that stability depended on practical competence as much as ceremonial grandeur. A mismanaged toll, a delayed grain shipment, or a failure to resolve a local quarrel could undermine authority as surely as a military defeat. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the early Capetian court was its cultivation of relationships and loyalty. Hugh Capet demonstrated that kingship depended on the perception of reliability and fairness. Through personal attention, gift-giving, and mediation, he strengthened bonds that supported both internal stability and the continuity of the dynasty. Nobles, clerics, and servants alike recognized the value of allegiance to a king who balanced authority with attentiveness. Over time, these relationships formed a network that allowed the monarchy to survive and gradually extend its influence across a kingdom that was still fragmented and largely autonomous in its regions. Despite these achievements, the court's influence was not absolute. Hugh Capet and his successors were still constrained by geography, communication limits, and the ambitions of regional lords. Paris provided a center of gravity, but the Capetians' authority depended on the continued diligence of both the king and his heirs in maintaining the networks, rituals, and administrative routines established during Hugh's reign. In this way, the court was a living institution, requiring constant attention, adaptation, and participation from those who inhabited it. The subtle work performed within Paris laid the foundation for the dynasty, but it also required ongoing effort to translate influence into enduring power. By the time Robert II ascended the throne, the Capetian court had already demonstrated its capacity to shape political outcomes through quiet, deliberate governance. The court's role as a hub of administration, ritual, and social hierarchy allowed the monarchy to extend its influence without relying on dramatic victories or spectacular displays of authority. Paris became the heart of a slowly emerging kingdom, a place where daily routines, careful attention to loyalty, and strategic use of ritual and symbolism intertwined to create stability. The lessons of this early court discipline, attentiveness, and the management of relationships would inform the Capetians for centuries, underpinning their reputation as patient, enduring rulers. Reflecting on the early Capetian court, one sees that its significance lies not in dramatic events but in the slow, deliberate shaping of authority. The dynasty's success depended on the accumulation of small, often invisible acts, the mediation of disputes, the monitoring of tolls, the careful observance of ritual, and the cultivation of loyalty. These were not glamorous achievements, yet they were powerful. The court in Paris demonstrated that governance could be effective through consistency, patience, and subtle influence, a lesson that resonates far beyond medieval France. And yet, even as the court solidified the Capetian dynasty's foundations, the question remained: would these quiet methods suffice to unify a kingdom over the long term? Could future kings maintain the delicate balance of ritual, administration, and personal relationships? Or would the ambitions of regional lords, the pressures of inheritance, and the complexity of governance eventually expose weaknesses in the system? The answers would unfold over the coming decades, but the early Capetian court had already demonstrated the enduring power of steady, meticulous, and almost invisible work, a reminder that history is often shaped less by spectacle than by careful, persistent attention to the details that sustain authority. Story 3: Dynastic Challenges, Family Tensions and Succession. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Capetian dynasty faced a challenge common to many medieval rulers: the management of succession. While Hugh Capet had successfully ascended the throne and established a fragile stability, the question of how power would pass to his heirs loomed over the court. Unlike modern states with codified laws of inheritance and formalized bureaucracies, medieval kingship relied heavily on personal relationships, the support of the nobility, and the tacit approval of the church. A dynasty's continuity could hinge on a single heir, a carefully negotiated marriage, or the subtle balance of loyalty among regional lords. Hugh Capet had secured the succession to his son, Robert II, through careful planning, but this smooth transition was the exception rather than the rule. Across Europe, dynastic disputes often erupted into civil wars, with brothers, uncles, and cousins vying for control. Within the Capetian family, ambition simmered quietly, even as outward appearances suggested harmony. Court chroniclers noted Robert's piety and diligence, but less visible were the tensions inherent in any system where multiple male heirs and powerful relatives had competing claims to wealth, titles, or influence. These tensions required careful management, and much of the early Capetian strategy revolved around preventing potential conflicts from escalating into open rebellion. One of the first challenges in managing succession was ensuring that the heir apparent was recognized both legally and symbolically during the reigning king's lifetime. Hugh Capet had initiated this process by having Robert crowned and anointed while Hugh was still alive, a practice that reinforced legitimacy and established continuity. Yet even this precaution did not eliminate uncertainty. Nobles could still challenge the heir's authority, especially if they perceived weakness in the reigning king or personal advantage in supporting an alternative claimant. In the Capetian context, where political authority rested less on formal institutions and more on personal loyalty and perception, these potential fractures required constant attention. Marriage alliances played a critical role in managing family dynamics and succession. By arranging strategic marriages for his children, Hugh Capet sought to secure loyalty, consolidate lands, and mitigate rivalries. Robert's marriage to Constance of Arles, for example, would later have significant political implications, linking the Capetians with southern nobility while introducing new dynamics and potential conflicts into the royal household. Even in these early years, marriage was less about romance and more about the careful distribution of influence, a deliberate strategy for ensuring dynastic stability. Every union carried the potential to create allies or rivals, and the consequences often unfolded over decades rather than months. Within the royal household itself, tensions arose over the allocation of resources and titles. Younger sons and relatives who did not inherit the crown needed positions, lands, or ecclesiastical appointments to secure their status. Hugh Capet and his advisors had to carefully balance the distribution of power and wealth to prevent resentment or rebellion. Appointing a younger son as a count or granting him a position within a monastery were common strategies, but they required delicacy. Favor one relative too much and another might feel slighted. Neglect one, and he could become a source of instability. This quiet management of family ambition was a central, if often overlooked, aspect of medieval kingship. The Capetian approach to succession also relied heavily on the church. Ecclesiastical figures could legitimize claims, mediate disputes, and provide moral authority that rival claimants lacked. Bishops and abbots attended coronations, confirmed oaths of loyalty, and sometimes served as advisors to both the reigning king and the heir apparent. Their presence was not ceremonial alone. It reinforced the idea that kingship was divinely sanctioned, and that succession was more than a matter of personal ambition. By maintaining close ties with religious authorities, Hugh Capet created an additional layer of legitimacy that helped smooth potential tensions within the family. Despite these precautions, the Capetians were not immune to disputes. Even minor slights, perceived injustices, or disagreements over land and titles could generate tension within the royal household. Chroniclers of the period often noted familial friction in passing, suggesting that much of the real negotiation took place behind closed doors. Quiet consultations, the exchange of gifts, subtle threats, and careful diplomacy. These efforts were largely invisible to outsiders, yet they were critical for ensuring that the dynasty remained intact. The Capetians' survival in these early years owed as much to these behind-the-scenes maneuvers as to military skill or ceremonial authority. Another layer of complexity was the role of regional lords in succession disputes. Powerful vassals could influence or even disrupt the intended inheritance by supporting rival claims or exploiting family tensions. Hugh Capet understood that controlling the loyalty of these nobles required careful attention to their ambitions and grievances. Marriage alliances, grants of privilege, and personal diplomacy were deployed not only to secure the heir's position, but also to prevent opportunistic interference. The Capetian dynasty's early survival depended on managing these external pressures as skillfully as internal ones, often through patient, understated negotiation rather than force. Even economic considerations influenced succession. The distribution of estates, revenues, and privileges could strengthen or weaken an heir's position. Hugh Capet and his advisors monitored the flow of resources carefully, ensuring that Robert would have sufficient means to maintain authority while avoiding resentment among other family members. In an era when economic power underpinned political influence, this attention to detail was essential. The quiet administration of land and wealth, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, was a key factor in the dynasty's ability to navigate potential crises. The stakes of these dynamics became clearer in subsequent generations, but even in Hugh Capet's lifetime, the fragility of succession was a constant concern. Every decision carried implications for loyalty, stability, and the long-term survival of the dynasty. The Capetians learned early that kingship was not merely a matter of coronation. It was the ongoing management of relationships, perception, and resources, a delicate balance between authority and accommodation. The quiet work of mediation, negotiation, and strategic planning shaped the survival of the dynasty far more than the occasional battle or political drama recorded in chronicles. By the end of Section 1, the challenges of dynastic succession in the early Capetian period are evident. Hugh Capet's careful planning, reliance on marriage alliances, and cultivation of ecclesiastical support had established a foundation for continuity, yet the potential for disruption remained ever present. Questions lingered. Could the dynasty maintain this fragile equilibrium across generations? Would subsequent kings possess the patience, prudence, and political skill to manage family ambitions and noble pressures effectively? The early Capetians had survived the initial challenge of succession, but the enduring test of dynasty lay in their ability to manage the quiet, persistent forces that threatened stability from within as much as from without. When Robert II ascended the throne in 996, he inherited more than just the kingship of France. He inherited a fragile equilibrium carefully cultivated by his father. Hugh Capet, a kingdom held together less by force than by loyalty, rituals, and networks of obligation. The smooth transition that Hugh had orchestrated masked the underlying tension inherent in any hereditary system. the ambitions of relatives, the restlessness of regional lords, and the uncertainty of the succession itself. Robert's early years as king were defined by the quiet negotiation of these pressures, and his approach would shape the dynasty for generations. Robert, known to history as Robert the Pious for his devoutness, brought a temperament markedly different from his father's cautious pragmatism. Where Hugh had relied on incremental consolidation and meticulous administration, Robert's piety sometimes influenced political decisions, particularly regarding marriage and alliances. His personal faith and moral convictions were interwoven with his role as king, lending him moral authority but occasionally complicating the delicate balance of dynastic politics. This integration of religious observance with governance would become both a source of legitimacy and a potential point of tension within the royal household. One of the first challenges Robert faced was the ongoing management of family relations. Younger siblings, cousins, and other relatives of the royal line required careful placement to avoid disputes over power, titles, or lands. Robert, much like his father before him, relied on a combination of grants, ecclesiastical appointments, and marriages to secure loyalty and mitigate rivalry. Younger sons who might have contested the crown were often given territories or positions within the church, a dual strategy that preserved family unity while maintaining political stability. These decisions were delicate, requiring both foresight and tact. A misstep could embolden ambitious relatives and destabilize the kingdom. Marriage alliances continued to play a crucial role. Robert's own marital decisions, particularly his union with Constance of Arles, illustrate the intricate interplay of politics, family, and ambition. Constance brought southern connections, linking the Capetians with influential Provençal nobility, but her presence also introduced new tensions. Conflicts over the influence of her relatives, disputes about the succession of heirs, and cultural differences added layers of complexity to the court. The king had to balance his obligations to his wife's family with his duties to the Capetian line, demonstrating the ongoing challenge of integrating marriage into the framework of dynastic stability. The royal court, centered in Paris, continued to serve as the hub for managing these challenges. Daily life rituals, administrative oversight, and social hierarchy provided both structure and authority. Robert's interactions with nobles, clerics, and relatives reinforced loyalty and maintained the perception of competence. Court ceremonies, feasts, and religious observances were not mere tradition. They were tools for governance, signaling royal favor, confirming obligations, and subtly reminding subjects and relatives alike of the king's authority. In a kingdom where power was personal rather than institutional, these rituals were essential. Managing the nobility remained a persistent concern. Regional lords possessed substantial autonomy, and their support was never guaranteed. Some sought to exploit potential disputes within the royal family to increase their influence, while others remained loyal out of respect or tradition. Robert's strategy combined diplomacy, negotiation, and selective enforcement. Grants of land, confirmation of privileges, and mediation of local disputes reinforced loyalty, while careful attention to potential sources of resentment minimized the risk of rebellion. Again, the work was largely invisible, carried out in private councils and correspondence, yet it was essential for the long-term survival of the dynasty. Religious authority continued to underpin Robert's legitimacy. Bishops and abbots were actively involved in confirming oaths of loyalty, mediating disputes, and legitimizing decisions regarding succession and family arrangements. The church's role in these matters was both practical and symbolic. By integrating ecclesiastical support into governance, Robert strengthened the perception of divine sanction for his rule and mitigated potential disputes that might arise from secular rivals. The intertwining of religious observance with political strategy became a hallmark of the early Capetian dynasty. Robert also faced the challenge of economic and territorial management. The kingdom's wealth and stability depended on the careful administration of lands, collection of tolls, and oversight of markets. As the crown extended its influence slowly beyond the Isle de France, Robert had to ensure that revenues were collected efficiently and that local disputes did not disrupt the fragile network of loyalty. Mismanagement of these practical matters could weaken perception of royal authority, just as skillful oversight could reinforce it. In this sense, daily administrative diligence was as critical as ceremonial display or military strength in maintaining dynastic stability. Even with these careful measures, tensions within the royal family occasionally erupted into public disputes. Chroniclers record episodes of disagreement over inheritance, succession, and the distribution of power between heirs. While these conflicts rarely escalated into full-scale rebellion during Robert's early reign, they illustrate the fragility inherent in hereditary monarchy. Every decision carried consequences. The wrong grant, the overlooked slight, or the mishandled marriage could spark discord. Robert's success depended on a combination of prudence, foresight, and the ability to reconcile competing interests within both the family and the wider nobility. By the end of Section 2, it becomes evident that Robert II's early reign was as much about managing human relationships and perceptions as it was about exercising formal authority. The quiet, deliberate strategies he employed balancing family ambition, securing noble loyalty, and integrating religious sanction were essential to the long-term survival of the Capetian dynasty. Yet the potential for disruption remained ever present. Questions lingered. Could Robert navigate the pressures of succession and family tension without fracturing the kingdom? Would the delicate equilibrium established by Hugh Capet endure in the hands of a king whose priorities blended piety with politics? The dynasty's resilience would depend not on spectacular acts, but on the sustained, meticulous management of these intertwined forces. As Robert II settled into his kingship in the early 11th century, it became increasingly clear that the Capetian dynasty's survival depended less on dramatic victories or displays of power than on the careful management of family relationships, noble loyalty, and ecclesiastical support. The early years of his reign were dominated by subtle negotiation, distributing lands to secure loyalty, arranging strategic marriages, and ensuring that younger relatives had positions that prevented rivalry from escalating into rebellion. In this quiet, deliberate work lay the enduring strength of the dynasty. One of Robert's first achievements was the consolidation of the succession. Unlike the violent disputes that had plagued other European dynasties, the Capetians managed to maintain continuity through a combination of ritual, diplomacy, and careful allocation of resources. Robert confirmed his eldest son's position as heir, arranging for his recognition by key nobles and clergy alike. The crown's stability was reinforced by ceremonial acts, public oaths, religious blessing, and strategic appearances at local courts which communicated both continuity and legitimacy. These actions were not spectacular, but they were effective. They reassured both nobles and subjects that the royal line would continue without chaos, cementing the quiet authority the dynasty relied upon. Marriage alliances continued to be a delicate but powerful tool for managing both internal and external tensions. Robert's union with Constance of Arles had initially stirred some friction, particularly with nobles wary of southern influence. However, the strategic distribution of her relatives across court and local offices helped integrate her family into the Capetian network, expanding the dynasty's influence while managing potential sources of conflict. Subsequent marriages for Robert's children and close relatives followed similar patterns, reinforcing loyalty and creating bonds that transcended simple bloodline claims. The dynasty's strength grew through the web of personal relationships woven carefully across generations. The management of younger siblings and relatives also required subtle attention. Robert appointed younger sons to ecclesiastical positions, ensuring they were occupied with spiritual duties while still retaining status and influence within the kingdom. These appointments served a dual purpose. They satisfied the ambitions of potential rivals while strengthening ties to the church, which in turn reinforced the moral authority of the Capetian monarchy. The careful balance of family ambition and religious integration became a defining feature of Capetian rule, demonstrating that stability often relied on subtlety rather than force. Noble loyalty, always a delicate matter, was maintained through a combination of negotiation, patronage, and oversight. Robert confirmed privileges, mediated disputes, and distributed lands in ways that reinforced allegiance without appearing heavy-handed. Even minor acts, a grant of land here, a personal gift there, the timely resolution of a local quarrel had far-reaching consequences for the perception of royal authority. In the absence of a strong centralized bureaucracy, such attentiveness was essential. The Capetians demonstrated that authority could be exercised through patience, diligence, and careful attention to the daily realities of governance. Economic oversight remained another pillar of stability. The administration of tolls, markets, and estates was closely monitored to ensure the smooth functioning of the kingdom. These mundane details were intertwined with political authority. Mismanagement could spark resentment, disrupt trade, or weaken perception of royal competence. By maintaining control over both material resources and the mechanisms of local governance, Robert reinforced the centrality of the crown, while avoiding overt confrontation with powerful regional lords. In this way, the Capetians ensured that stability was as much about practical competence as it was about symbolic or ceremonial authority. Religious authority continued to provide both legitimacy and a stabilizing influence. Bishops, abbots, and monks were involved not only in spiritual matters, but also in legal mediation, ceremonial affirmation of succession, and the reconciliation of family tensions. The integration of ecclesiastical support into governance gave the monarchy moral weight and reinforced the perception of divine sanction for the dynasty. By cultivating these relationships carefully, Robert strengthened both internal cohesion and the external perception of authority. Despite these efforts, tensions were never fully eliminated. Family disagreements, noble ambitions, and external pressures remained constant threats to the fragile equilibrium of the kingdom. Yet the Capetians, approach to address disputes quietly, manage ambitions methodically, and integrate religious and political authority proved resilient. The dynasty's early survival demonstrated that long-term stability often relies on consistent, patient effort rather than sudden action or forceful intervention. The quiet work of kingship, though less visible in historical narratives, was central to the endurance of the Capetians. By the end of Robert II's early reign, it was clear that the dynasty had established a durable model for succession. Authority had been maintained through a careful combination of familial management, noble oversight, economic control, and religious integration. The Capetians had learned that kingship in a fragmented, decentralized kingdom required meticulous attention to relationships, routine, and the small acts that cumulatively reinforced legitimacy. These lessons would guide future generations, allowing the dynasty to survive and expand its influence across France. Reflecting on the early Capetian experience, one sees a broader principle in the exercise of power. Stability is often achieved not through spectacle or sudden conquest, but through patient, deliberate, and often invisible work. Managing family ambitions, integrating new alliances, and balancing competing pressures required both foresight and discipline. The dynasty's survival depended as much on careful negotiation and attention to detail as on ceremonial acts or military strength. In this sense, the early Capetians exemplify a form of kingship that values prudence and patience above immediate glory. Yet even with these achievements, the question remained: could the Capetians maintain this delicate balance in the centuries to come? Could future kings replicate the steady accumulation of authority that allowed Hugh Capet and Robert II to consolidate their rule? Or would ambition, circumstance, or mismanagement eventually expose vulnerabilities? The dynasty's endurance would depend on the continued exercise of quiet, meticulous governance, a lesson in the subtle art of sustaining power over time. Story 4. The Capetians and the Church: Piety, Patronage, and Power. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Capetian kings understood that their authority rested not only on the loyalty of nobles, but also on the perception of divine approval. The Church was both a spiritual institution and a political ally, capable of legitimizing kingship, mediating disputes, and reinforcing social hierarchy. For Hugh Capet and his son Robert II, cultivating a strong relationship with ecclesiastical authorities was not optional, it was essential. Without the support of bishops, abbots, and monks, the monarchy risked appearing weak, vulnerable, or illegitimate, especially in a kingdom where authority was fragmented and dependent on personal loyalty. Hugh Capet had already demonstrated the importance of ecclesiastical backing in his coronation. By securing the anointing of the Archbishop of Reims, he linked his kingship to divine sanction, signaling to nobles and subjects alike that his authority was not merely human but blessed by God. The ritual of coronation, with its sacred oils, chants, and ceremonial gestures, was more than symbolic theater, it was a tangible expression of the monarchy's legitimacy. The presence of clergy at the ceremony reinforced a network of moral and spiritual oversight, binding the king's authority to the broader religious and cultural framework of medieval France. Under Robert II, this relationship deepened. Known as Robert the Pious for his devoutness, the king actively sought to demonstrate personal devotion, observing fasts, attending mass, and patronizing monasteries. Piety was not merely private, it was a visible and deliberate form of political expression. By aligning himself closely with the church, Robert reinforced his legitimacy, projecting an image of moral authority that extended beyond the boundaries of Paris and the Ile-de-France. This strategy was subtle but powerful. In a society where divine favor was equated with right to rule, overt piety enhanced both perception and practical authority. Patronage of religious institutions became a cornerstone of Capetian policy. Monasteries and abbeys were more than centers of worship. They were hubs of literacy, record-keeping, and local influence. By funding construction projects, confirming privileges, and donating lands, the kings cultivated loyalty and secured allies who could act as intermediaries in disputes, advisors in governance, and guarantors of succession. Patronage also served a symbolic function, projecting the image of a king who respected spiritual authority and shared in the moral responsibilities of leadership. This investment in the church was both practical and emblematic, intertwining governance with piety in ways that strengthened the dynasty's foundations. The church's role extended into administration and justice. Bishops and abbots often mediated disputes between nobles, confirmed legal agreements, and advised on matters ranging from taxation to land allocation. Their involvement lent legitimacy to decisions and reinforced social order. In effect, the early Capetian monarchy functioned in partnership with the church. The king provided protection, patronage, and authority, while ecclesiastical figures reinforced moral sanction, mediated conflict, and maintained a network of influence that extended across the kingdom. This symbiosis was delicate. The king had to respect the church's authority without appearing subordinate, while clergy had to navigate the line between spiritual guidance and political intervention. Religious rituals were woven into the daily life of the court. Mass, prayer, and feast day observances punctuated the calendar, reinforcing both social hierarchy and royal authority. Nobles and courtiers were expected to participate, demonstrating their own piety while acknowledging the king's central role in the divine order. The rhythm of religious observance also shaped governance. Important meetings, decisions, and ceremonies were coordinated around liturgical events, blending the sacred with the secular. In this context, the Capetian court was as much a spiritual center as a political one, and the king's attention to religious detail was inseparable from his exercise of power. The symbolic power of the church also influenced succession. By involving clergy in coronations, oaths of fealty, and confirmations of land grants, the monarchy ensured that heirs were recognized not only by nobles but also by the moral authority of the church. Robert II's piety and relationship with ecclesiastical leaders provided an additional layer of legitimacy that helped prevent disputes over succession. Religious sanction became a mechanism for reinforcing continuity, subtly shaping the dynasty's ability to maintain stability in a kingdom still fragmented by local loyalties and semi-autonomous territories. Yet the alliance between the Capetians and the church was not without challenges. Clergy had their own ambitions and could act independently or even in opposition to royal authority. Some bishops and abbots controlled extensive lands, levied taxes, and wielded influence comparable to that of secular lords. Balancing the demands of the church with the requirements of governance required diplomacy, patience, and strategic foresight. Kings like Robert II had to navigate this terrain carefully, assert too much authority, and they risked alienating powerful clerics, defer too much, and they could appear weak or indecisive. The subtle art of maintaining equilibrium between secular and religious power became a defining feature of Capetian rule. By the end of Section 1, it is clear that the relationship between the Capetians and the church was multifaceted, combining personal piety, political patronage, administrative partnership, and symbolic legitimacy. The monarchy's authority was reinforced through ritual, alliances, and daily attention to the spiritual dimension of governance. Yet questions remained. Could the kings maintain this delicate balance as the dynasty expanded its influence? Would ecclesiastical support remain constant in the face of ambition, conflict, or changing circumstances? The early Capetians had demonstrated the importance of cultivating the church, but the long-term durability of this strategy depended on continued vigilance and care. During Robert II's early reign, the intersection of faith and politics became increasingly apparent. His devout reputation, earning him the epithet the Pious, was not only a personal trait, but also a calculated tool for consolidating authority. In a kingdom where secular power was fragmented, ecclesiastical endorsement provided an invaluable form of legitimacy. By cultivating monasteries, supporting abbeys, and engaging in visible acts of devotion, Robert intertwined piety with governance in a way that would define the early Capetian approach to kingship. Monasteries were central to this strategy. Far from being isolated spiritual retreats, they were hubs of administration, literacy, and local influence. Abbots often acted as mediators in disputes between nobles, advisors to the king, and custodians of valuable records documenting land ownership, feudal obligations, and privileges. Recognizing their power, Robert and his father had both invested in these institutions, granting lands, confirming privileges, and funding construction projects. Each act of patronage was a deliberate political statement. The king positioned himself as protector of the church, ensuring its loyalty while extending his own influence into regions often beyond direct royal control. One notable example was Robert's relationship with the Abbey of Saint-Denis, near Paris. Saint-Denis was more than a religious site. It was a center of royal memory and dynastic legitimacy. By supporting the abbey, Robert reinforced the sanctity of the Capetian lineage. Charters recorded donations of land and income to the monastery, establishing ongoing obligations between the royal house and the church. These gifts were not mere acts of charity, they were strategic investments. The abbey became a political ally, reinforcing the king's authority and symbolically linking divine favor to the dynasty's continuity. Patronage also extended to the creation and renovation of churches. By funding construction and embellishment, Robert demonstrated visible piety, which in turn served as a reminder to nobles and commoners alike of his divine favor. These acts were often public, staged during ceremonies or festivals to maximize their symbolic impact. The king's presence at such events, combined with donations and ritual participation, projected an image of moral authority that could rival even the most powerful regional lords. In this way, religious patronage functioned as both spiritual devotion and political theater. The church's influence also shaped succession and family dynamics. Clergy played a crucial role in legitimizing heirs, mediating disputes among relatives, and confirming oaths of fealty. Robert relied on bishops and abbots to reinforce the crown's authority over his children and younger siblings, using ecclesiastical sanction to prevent internal challenges to succession. The moral weight of the church was especially important in periods of tension, allowing the king to assert authority without resorting to violence or coercion. In effect, religion provided a stabilizing force that complemented the Capetians' careful administrative and diplomatic work. Robert's piety, however, was not without complications. His strict adherence to religious principles occasionally conflicted with political pragmatism, particularly in matters of marriage and alliance. For example, disputes over consanguinity in marriage, where kinship rules prohibited unions, required both religious consultation and careful negotiation to maintain political alliances. The king's personal devotion sometimes limited his flexibility, but it also enhanced his moral authority in the eyes of clergy and laypeople alike. These tensions illustrate the delicate balancing act inherent in early Capetian kingship. Faith strengthened legitimacy, yet it could also constrain political maneuvering. Monastic support also had practical administrative benefits. Monks and abbots often acted as scribes, legal advisors, and record keepers, preserving the charters and documents essential to governance. Their literacy and organizational skills allowed the Capetians to monitor land ownership, enforce obligations, and resolve disputes effectively. In an era without a centralized bureaucracy, these clerical networks provided critical infrastructure for royal administration. Patronage, therefore, was both a moral and pragmatic investment, enhancing the king's ability to govern through trusted intermediaries. Religious festivals and rituals further reinforced the connection between piety and power. Major feast days, processions, and public masses were carefully orchestrated to highlight the king's role as a divinely sanctioned ruler. Attendance by nobles and clergy was mandatory, and seating arrangements, gift exchanges, and ceremonial duties reflected social hierarchies and feudal obligations. In this sense, the church and the court were intertwined. Spiritual observance became a stage upon which political authority was displayed and reinforced. The Capetians' ability to manage this intersection of ritual, loyalty, and governance was critical to their early stability. By the end of Section 2, it is clear that Robert II's strategy of integrating piety, patronage, and politics provided the dynasty with both legitimacy and practical support. Monasteries served as centers of influence, record-keeping, and mediation, while public acts of devotion reinforced the king's moral authority. Yet questions remained. How sustainable was this dependence on ecclesiastical networks? Could the Capetians maintain the loyalty of both secular and religious elites over the long term, especially as the kingdom expanded and new challenges emerged? The dynasty had established a strong foundation, but the balance between piety and political necessity would continue to require careful attention in the years ahead. By the middle of the 11th century, the Capetian dynasty had established a remarkably enduring pattern of kingship, one in which the church and monarchy were deeply intertwined. Robert II's reign demonstrated that spiritual authority could serve as a stabilizing force, providing both moral legitimacy and practical governance tools. The early Capetians had learned that visible piety, strategic patronage, and careful attention to ecclesiastical alliances were as critical to their success as military skill or noble diplomacy. Their relationship with the church was not a passive one. It was an active, deliberate partnership that shaped the trajectory of the monarchy for generations. Monasteries and abbeys became more than spiritual centers, they were instruments of administration, social control, and political leverage. By granting lands, confirming privileges, and funding construction, Robert II ensured that religious institutions were loyal allies rather than independent rivals. This relationship created a network of influence that extended across the fragmented French kingdom. In practical terms, monasteries acted as agents of the crown, mediating disputes, maintaining records of land and obligations, and influencing local populations. In symbolic terms, they reinforced the king's image as a pious and divinely sanctioned ruler. Through these dual roles, the Capetians transformed religious patronage into a core element of statecraft. The moral authority conferred by the church also played a critical role in succession and internal cohesion. Bishops and abbots were called upon to legitimize heirs, oversee coronations, and confirm oaths of loyalty. Their endorsement mitigated potential disputes within the royal family and among the nobility. This ecclesiastical support helped prevent challenges to authority from developing into open conflict, demonstrating how moral and political legitimacy were deeply intertwined. By integrating religious sanction into the very mechanisms of governance, the Capetians secured a subtle but powerful tool for maintaining stability across generations. Robert II's personal piety, while genuine, also functioned as a political strategy. Public displays of devotion, fasting, attendance at Mass, patronage of monasteries, and participation in festivals projected an image of moral rectitude that reinforced loyalty and obedience among subjects. Nobles were reminded that the king's authority was not only social or political, but divinely approved. Clergy were encouraged to act as intermediaries and advisors, their support lending additional weight to the king's decisions. In an era where secular power alone could be contested, the combination of spiritual and temporal authority provided the Capetians with a uniquely resilient form of legitimacy. Yet this close relationship with the church was not without risk. Ecclesiastical figures were powerful actors in their own right, controlling extensive lands, collecting tithes, and commanding respect among local populations. Kings had to navigate these dynamics carefully, asserting authority without alienating influential clerics. The Capetians' success lay in their ability to manage this balance, demonstrating respect and devotion, while ensuring that religious institutions remained aligned with the crown's objectives. This nuanced diplomacy required attentiveness, patience, and strategic foresight, a skill set as essential as any battlefield tactic. The integration of piety and politics also extended into broader society. Public rituals, ceremonies, and festivals reinforced social hierarchies, confirmed obligations, and showcased the king's divine favor. Attendance by nobles, clergy, and even commoners was expected, making religious observance a public affirmation of loyalty and authority. By embedding governance within a spiritual framework, the Capetians created a system in which political and moral legitimacy were inseparable. Ordinary acts of devotion became acts of political reinforcement, and the line between faith and authority was intentionally blurred. By the end of Robert II's reign, the Capetians had established a durable model for the monarchy, one in which strategic religious patronage, personal piety, and careful ecclesiastical alliances underpinned political power. This approach helped maintain stability in a fragmented kingdom, provided mechanisms for succession and conflict resolution, and allowed the crown to gradually extend its influence beyond the Isle de France. It also left a lasting imprint on the French monarchy. The intertwining of spiritual and temporal authority became a hallmark of Capetian governance, influencing kings for centuries to come. Reflecting on the early Capetian relationship with the Church, one sees a broader lesson about the exercise of power. Authority is strengthened not only by force or wealth, but by the careful cultivation of legitimacy, alliances, and moral credibility. The dynasty's success relied on patience, strategy, and the consistent reinforcement of both temporal and spiritual influence. Yet questions remained. Could future kings maintain this delicate balance in the face of changing political circumstances, rising noble ambitions, or internal family disputes? Would the Church remain a cooperative ally, or eventually assert its independence in ways that challenged royal authority? The early Capetians had secured a foundation, but the endurance of their strategy would depend on the continued vigilance and skill of their successors. Story 5. Consolidating the Crown. Expansion beyond the Isle de France. At the dawn of the 11th century, the Capetian kings ruled over a kingdom that was strikingly fragmented. While Paris and the surrounding Isle de France formed the dynastic heartland, much of the rest of France was controlled by powerful regional lords whose allegiance was often nominal rather than practical. Dukes of Normandy, counts of Blois and Champagne, and viscounts in Aquitaine wielded armies, collected taxes, and administered justice largely independently. For the Capetians, authority was concentrated in a small geographic area. Beyond it, power was diffuse, dependent on fragile networks of loyalty and fealty. Consolidating the crown required patience, diplomacy, and a keen understanding of the subtle levers of influence. Hugh Capet had set a precedent. Kingship could endure even without direct control over distant territories. His strategy relied on securing loyalty where possible and avoiding unnecessary conflict elsewhere. Robert II inherited this approach, but faced the additional challenge of extending the monarchy's influence without provoking rebellion. The first step was to assess which regions were susceptible to Capetian authority, which required intelligence gathering, alliances through marriage, and the careful deployment of loyal vassals. Expansion was not achieved overnight. It was a slow, calculated process that demanded observation, negotiation, and occasional subtle displays of power. One avenue of influence was through vassalage and feudal obligations. While the Capetians lacked the military strength to enforce authority across distant territories, they could assert influence through formal recognition of overlordship, confirmation of privileges, and mediation in disputes. Counts and dukes were more likely to acknowledge the king's authority when it aligned with their interests or offered protection against rivals. By carefully selecting which lords to engage, and when, the Capetians extended their authority without overreaching, gradually building a web of influence that relied more on diplomacy and social obligation than on brute force. Marriage alliances remained a critical instrument of consolidation. Robert II's children and relatives were married into influential families across the kingdom, creating bonds that linked local power holders to the royal line. These unions served multiple purposes. They reinforced loyalty, facilitated cooperation in times of conflict, and ensured that future generations of regional lords had vested interests in the stability of the crown. Even when the king could not exercise direct control over a territory, these familial networks created indirect influence, slowly expanding the Capetians' reach without the need for conquest. Religious institutions also played a role in extending authority. Monasteries, abbeys, and bishops were often influential in regions distant from Paris. Through continued patronage and ecclesiastical diplomacy, the Capetians could shape local governance, mediate disputes, and reinforce the perception of royal authority. The king's moral and spiritual presence, manifested through charters, donations, and ceremonial recognition, lent weight to his influence in areas where physical power was limited. In essence, the monarchy expanded not only through territorial control, but also through networks of obligation, faith, and prestige. Despite these strategies, the limitations of Capetian authority were evident. Military campaigns were risky and expensive, and overextension could provoke alliances among powerful lords intent on resisting royal influence. Moreover, communication and enforcement were constrained by geography, infrastructure, and technology. A distant rebellion could erupt and persist before the king even became aware of it. As a result, early Capetian expansion was cautious, incremental, and heavily dependent on negotiation, alliances, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. The king's court in Paris remained the center of this consolidation effort. It served as the hub where information about distant territories was gathered, strategies were debated, and relationships with influential lords were managed. Envoys and messengers provided intelligence about local tensions, harvests, disputes, and alliances, allowing the monarchy to intervene selectively. The court also functioned as a symbolic center of authority. Its ceremonies, patronage, and administration projected stability and legitimacy that extended outward, subtly reinforcing the perception of the king's central role in the political landscape. Economic influence was another tool of expansion. Control over tolls, markets, and trade routes in and around the Ile-de-France provided resources that could be leveraged to reward loyalty or negotiate alliances. Wealth enabled the king to fund construction projects, support loyal vassals, and maintain the court's influence. While the Capetians could not yet command the vast resources of their realm, they demonstrated that careful economic management could amplify their authority and sustain gradual expansion. By the end of Section 1, the challenge faced by the early Capetians is clear. Ruling a fragmented kingdom required more than military might. Authority was extended through diplomacy, marriage, religious patronage, and the careful management of loyalty and perception. The monarchy's influence was strongest in the Ile-de-France but slowly radiated outward, contingent on networks of obligation, strategic alliances, and subtle demonstrations of legitimacy. The question remained, could the Capetians gradually consolidate power across the broader kingdom, or would entrenched regional lords resist the crown's expansion for decades to come? The process of unifying France under a central authority was only beginning, and it would unfold over generations through patience, strategy, and meticulous governance. Robert II's reign was marked by the challenge of governing a kingdom that was as politically fragmented as it was geographically vast. While the Ile-de-France provided a secure base, most of the surrounding territories were controlled by regional lords who often viewed royal authority with suspicion. Direct conquest was rarely feasible. Instead, Robert relied on a combination of alliances, marriages, ecclesiastical influence, and targeted campaigns to gradually extend his influence beyond the crown's immediate heartland. One of the most effective tools for consolidating authority was alliance building. Robert negotiated carefully with powerful neighboring lords, seeking to turn potential rivals into cooperative allies. These negotiations often involved marriages, reciprocal recognition of titles, or promises of mediation in disputes. By creating networks of mutual obligation, Robert expanded the monarchy's reach indirectly. For example, alliances with counts in the Loire Valley and the Champagne region allowed him to secure loyalty and influence without deploying large armies, demonstrating the effectiveness of diplomacy over brute force in consolidating early Capetian authority. Marriage continued to be a key instrument. Robert II's children and close relatives were married strategically into prominent families throughout the kingdom, establishing bonds that reinforced loyalty and created vested interests in the crown's stability. Each union carried both symbolic and practical weight. The offspring of these marriages were potential heirs to local territories, while the families themselves were more likely to support the monarchy in times of dispute. These alliances exemplified the careful long-term thinking that characterized the Capetian approach to expansion. Influence was extended not only through immediate action, but also through the slow cultivation of loyalty across generations. Targeted military campaigns complemented these alliances. While the Capetians did not command the massive armies of some regional lords, they could project force strategically, particularly when combined with support from loyal vassals. Campaigns were often designed to reinforce existing authority rather than seize new territories outright. By demonstrating the capacity to enforce loyalty selectively, Robert II strengthened his position without provoking widespread rebellion. The careful timing and limited scope of these operations illustrate the dynasty's preference for incremental consolidation over risky confrontation. Ecclesiastical influence also played a pivotal role in extending royal authority. Monasteries, abbeys, and bishops often controlled substantial territories and resources, and their support could amplify the king's influence in regions beyond Paris. By confirming privileges, mediating disputes, and securing clerical endorsement, Robert reinforced the perception of authority in areas where direct control was limited. Religious networks thus became a force multiplier, allowing the crown to exert influence across a decentralized kingdom without resorting to full-scale conquest. Administrative oversight, though modest by modern standards, was another subtle mechanism for consolidation. The Capetians monitored tolls, markets, and local courts within the Ile-de-France, setting standards for governance and justice that neighboring regions gradually recognized. These administrative precedents created expectations of royal authority and demonstrated competence, which could be invoked in negotiations or disputes with distant lords. By establishing norms and demonstrating effectiveness in their core territories, the kings projected influence outward, gradually shaping the political landscape beyond the heartland. Economic incentives reinforced these strategies. Land grants, privileges, and monetary support for loyal vassals ensured continued cooperation and rewarded obedience. The careful distribution of resources, often in concert with alliances and religious patronage, allowed Robert II to solidify networks of influence across the kingdom. Wealth was both a tool of persuasion and a symbol of stability, reinforcing the perception that the crown could maintain order, protect interests, and mediate disputes effectively. Despite these efforts, the expansion of Capetian authority was slow and uneven. Regional lords jealously guarded their autonomy, and the decentralized nature of the kingdom limited the king's capacity for direct control. Success often depended on negotiation, patience, and opportunism rather than military dominance. The gradual accumulation of influence required careful attention to relationships, strategic timing, and the subtle exercise of authority. Even minor failures, delayed responses to disputes, overlooked slights, or mismanaged alliances could weaken the crown's position and embolden regional actors to assert independence. By the end of Section 2, Robert II's strategy for consolidating authority is clear. It relied on patient, incremental measures that combined diplomacy, marriage, ecclesiastical support, targeted military action, and economic leverage. The monarchy's reach extended slowly, shaped as much by perception and loyalty as by tangible control. Yet questions lingered. Could this measured approach ultimately unify the kingdom, or would the autonomy of powerful regional lords continue to limit Capetian influence for decades? The process of consolidation had begun, but the outcome remained uncertain, dependent on both skillful governance and the resilience of the dynasty's strategic networks. By the mid-11th century, Robert II had demonstrated that the Capetians could extend their influence beyond the Ile-de-France without relying solely on military conquest. The kingdom remained politically fragmented, but subtle diplomacy, strategic marriages, ecclesiastical support, and careful administration had allowed the crown to project authority farther than Hugh Capet had achieved. These incremental gains laid the groundwork for a monarchy that would gradually evolve from a fragile regional power into a cohesive political force. Robert's alliances were crucial to this process. By cultivating relationships with counts, dukes, and viscounts, He ensured that the crown's authority was recognized even in territories where direct control was limited. Reciprocal obligations, mediated by marriage or feudal recognition, created a web of influence that extended the monarchy's reach. Even when enforcement was difficult, these networks encouraged cooperation, reduced the risk of open rebellion, and provided mechanisms for negotiating disputes. Over time, loyalty became both a strategic and symbolic measure of royal influence, reinforcing the Capetians' emerging reputation as patient and prudent rulers. Marriage alliances further strengthened this network. Robert II carefully orchestrated unions for his children and close relatives with influential families throughout the kingdom. These alliances linked regional lords to the crown in both political and personal terms, creating stakes for local actors in the stability of the monarchy. While immediate control over lands or armies remained limited, these familial bonds extended influence in ways that were less visible but equally powerful. The Capetians' ability to weave loyalty into the fabric of family networks demonstrated the long-term thinking that characterized their rule. The church remained a critical partner in this expansion. Monasteries, abbeys, and bishops reinforced royal authority through both moral legitimacy and practical administration. Ecclesiastical figures could mediate disputes, maintain records, and influence local populations, amplifying the crown's influence far beyond Paris. Patronage, religious ceremony, and visible piety enhanced the king's image while securing cooperation from clerics whose power was comparable to that of regional lords. The Capetians understood that spiritual endorsement translated into political strength, and they invested accordingly. Targeted military interventions complemented these efforts. While Robert II lacked the resources to wage large-scale conquest, carefully chosen campaigns reinforced the monarchy's credibility. Demonstrations of force were used sparingly but effectively, signaling the crown's capacity to protect interests and enforce loyalty when necessary. These interventions were calculated to strengthen alliances, deter rebellion, and ensure that negotiation remained the primary tool of consolidation. The Capetians recognized that prudence often carried more weight than raw strength in shaping long-term political influence. Economic management also reinforced expansion. Control over tolls, markets, and revenues within the Ile-de-France provided resources to support loyal vassals, fund patronage, and sustain the court. These material tools complemented alliances, marriages, and ecclesiastical networks, providing a tangible foundation for influence. The careful administration of wealth became a hallmark of Capetian strategy, demonstrating that authority was as much about competence and resource management as it was about ceremony or piety. Despite these successes, the kingdom remained a patchwork of semi-autonomous territories. Powerful regional lords continued to guard their independence, and the crown's influence was often contingent on ongoing negotiation and vigilance. The process of consolidation was slow, requiring patience, foresight, and meticulous attention to relationships. Yet the Capetians had established a model for extending influence gradually, relying on networks, symbols of legitimacy, and careful administration rather than confrontation alone. By the end of Robert II's reign, the Capetians had laid enduring foundations for a monarchy capable of projecting authority beyond its original heartland. The combination of diplomacy, marriage, ecclesiastical patronage, targeted intervention, and economic oversight created a resilient structure of influence that would support future expansion. The kingdom was not yet unified under direct royal control, but the mechanisms of consolidation were in place, ensuring that subsequent generations could build on the careful groundwork established in the early 11th century. Reflecting on this period, one sees that the Capetians' strategy was defined by subtlety and patience. Authority was extended through relationships, legitimacy, and the careful exercise of influence rather than through sudden conquest or dramatic displays of power. The dynasty demonstrated that long-term consolidation depends on cumulative, often invisible efforts, the negotiation of alliances, the cultivation of loyalty, and the management of perception. Yet the ultimate question remained: would future kings maintain this deliberate approach, or would new challenges, ambitious nobles, contested succession, or external threats force the crown into more direct confrontation? The slow spread of Capetian authority had begun, but the evolution of France into a unified kingdom was a story still unfolding over the coming centuries. Story 6: Capetian relations with Normandy, allies and rivals. In the early 11th century, the Duchy of Normandy loomed large on the political landscape of northern France. Its dukes controlled substantial lands, commanded disciplined armies, and exercised authority with a level of autonomy that rivaled the king himself. For the Capetians, who were still consolidating power within the Île-de-France and gradually extending influence outward, Normandy represented both a potential ally and a formidable rival. Managing relations with the duchy required a careful mixture of diplomacy, strategic marriage, and cautious assertion of authority, balancing opportunity with restraint. Normandy's strategic location made it particularly significant. Positioned along the Seine and facing the English Channel, it controlled vital trade routes and had access to maritime resources that could support military campaigns or commercial ventures. Its dukes, often ambitious and militarily capable, were keenly aware of their leverage over the French crown. At the same time, their recognition of Capetian authority was largely ceremonial. In practice, Normandy operated as a semi-independent state, collecting its own revenues, administering justice, and defending its borders. The Capetian kings could influence Normandy only indirectly, through alliances, mediation, or the occasional show of force. The first step in managing this relationship was diplomacy. Hugh Capet and later Robert II sought to establish personal ties with the ducal family, using negotiation and mutual recognition to prevent conflict. Courtiers and envoys traveled between Paris and Rouen, carrying messages, negotiating marriages, and confirming agreements. These exchanges were subtle yet essential. They allowed the Capetians to assert influence, gather intelligence about Norman intentions, and cultivate goodwill, all while avoiding direct confrontation that could provoke a military response from a powerful neighbor. Marriage alliances were particularly important in this context. Robert II and his family arranged unions with Norman nobility to create bonds of loyalty and kinship. These marriages served multiple purposes. They reinforced political alliances, established potential claims or influence over Norman lands, and provided a channel for negotiation in times of tension. By intertwining families, the Capetians sought to mitigate the risk posed by a powerful duchy and to encourage cooperation rather than conflict. Such unions were delicate, as kinship ties could both prevent and provoke rivalry depending on succession and inheritance. Religious institutions further mediated the relationship between the crown and Normandy. Bishops and abbots wielded influence over both secular and ecclesiastical affairs, often acting as intermediaries between the Capetians and the dukes. By confirming privileges, mediating disputes, and endorsing agreements, the Church provided a framework for peaceful interaction. Its authority was recognized by both sides, making it a crucial mechanism for negotiating complex political terrain. In essence, the spiritual and political spheres overlapped, and the careful cultivation of ecclesiastical support reinforced stability in these sensitive relationships. Norman ambitions occasionally clashed with Capetian interests, highlighting the fragility of this balance. Disputes over lands, titles, or the succession of vassals could threaten peace and required careful handling. The Capetians relied on negotiation, temporary alliances, and selective assertion of authority to prevent escalation. Military action was considered a last resort, used only when diplomacy failed, and when the monarchy could rely on sufficient support from loyal vassals or allies. Even minor skirmishes carried the risk of broader conflict, given the military capability of the dukes and their network of subordinate lords. Trade and economic ties also played a subtle role in consolidating influence. Normandy's ports facilitated commerce with England, Flanders, and beyond, providing revenue and resources that could benefit both the duchy and the crown. By regulating tolls, confirming privileges, or supporting merchants, the Capetians could engage Normandy in mutually beneficial arrangements. Economic interdependence became another layer of influence, complementing diplomacy, marriage, and ecclesiastical mediation. By the end of Section 1, the relationship between the Capetians and Normandy emerges as a delicate and complex balance. The duchy was powerful enough to challenge the crown, but also valuable as a potential ally in the fragmented political landscape of northern France. Success depended on careful diplomacy, strategic family alliances, ecclesiastical support, and economic negotiation. Questions remained. Could the Capetians maintain long-term stability with a neighbor whose power rivaled their own? Would the intertwining of kinship, faith, and politics be sufficient to prevent future conflict, or were tensions merely postponed? Normandy loomed as both opportunity and threat, and the early Capetians' skill in managing this relationship would shape the trajectory of their monarchy for decades to come. As Robert II sought to consolidate the Capetian monarchy, Normandy remained both a challenge and an opportunity. The Dukes of Normandy were ambitious, well-resourced, and accustomed to operating independently of royal authority. Yet they were not invulnerable to diplomatic overtures, marriage alliances, or ecclesiastical influence. Over the course of the early 11th century, the Capetians developed a strategy that combined negotiation, kinship ties, and selective military action to navigate this complex relationship. Marriage alliances were central to this approach. Robert II's children and close relatives were married into Norman families to strengthen bonds of loyalty and provide potential leverage over the duchy. These unions were carefully calculated. They created familial obligations that could discourage rebellion, provided indirect claims in Norman succession disputes, and aligned interests across regional borders. For example, marriages connecting Capetian and Norman houses allowed the kings to influence the duchy without direct confrontation, using the power of kinship to secure cooperation in times of tension. These arrangements required careful planning, as disputes over inheritance or succession could turn alliances into sources of rivalry if mismanaged. Diplomacy extended beyond family ties. Courtiers and envoys played a vital role in managing day-to-day relations with Normandy. Letters, emissaries, and ceremonial visits allowed the Capetians to monitor political developments, offer mediation, and reinforce obligations of fealty. Treaties often included provisions for mutual defense, recognition of titles, and the resolution of disputes, reflecting the delicate balance of power between the crown and the duchy. These agreements were rarely permanent but established frameworks for cooperation, allowing both sides to manage tensions without resorting to open conflict. Ecclesiastical mediation further strengthened this balance. Bishops and abbots were trusted intermediaries, capable of legitimizing agreements, confirming privileges, and advocating for both sides in disputes. Religious institutions offered a shared moral and social framework, which both the Capetians and the Norman dukes could invoke to justify decisions and resolve conflicts. By integrating church authority into diplomacy, the monarchy leveraged moral legitimacy alongside secular power, creating a stabilizing influence that could extend across political boundaries. Tensions inevitably arose, particularly over disputed lands, vassal loyalty, and succession claims. When conflicts emerged, Robert II's response was calculated. He relied on selective shows of force or threats to assert authority, but avoided full-scale confrontation that could provoke retaliation. Skirmishes or limited campaigns were conducted strategically, often in coordination with allied vassals or in response to violations of agreements. These measured interventions reinforced the crown's credibility while minimizing the risk of escalation, illustrating the Capetians' preference for pragmatism over aggression in dealing with a powerful neighbor. Economic considerations also shaped the relationship. Normandy's control of ports and trade routes provided both wealth and strategic leverage. By regulating tolls, supporting merchants, and negotiating trade privileges, the Capetians created a network of economic interdependence with Normandy. These arrangements strengthened alliances, reinforced mutual interests, and provided indirect influence over a duchy that might otherwise resist royal authority. Wealth, trade, and patronage became tools of diplomacy, complementing marriage and ecclesiastical influence. Over time, these strategies produced a delicate equilibrium. Normandy remained a semi-autonomous power, but the combination of familial bonds, negotiated agreements, ecclesiastical support, and selective military intervention allowed the Capetians to project influence and maintain stability along the northern frontier. The relationship was dynamic, requiring constant attention, adaptability, and negotiation. Success depended on patience, foresight, and the ability to integrate multiple forms of leverage kinship, faith, economy, and force into a coherent strategy. By the end of Section 2, it is clear that the Capetians' approach to Normandy was defined by subtlety and long-term thinking. Rather than attempting to dominate outright, the kings sought to influence, negotiate, and cultivate loyalty over time. Yet questions remained. Could this fragile balance withstand changes in leadership, shifts in ducal ambition, or broader political upheavals? Would the interweaving of family, faith, and diplomacy be enough to prevent future conflict, or were tensions merely deferred? The story of Capetian-Norman relations highlights the careful, persistent work required to manage powerful neighbors in a fragmented medieval kingdom. By the later years of Robert II's reign, the Capetians had established a careful and resilient framework for managing relations with the Duchy of Normandy. While the dukes retained substantial autonomy, the crown had succeeded in creating a network of influence that relied on diplomacy, marriage alliances, ecclesiastical mediation, and the selective application of force. This approach exemplified the Capetians' broader strategy of consolidating authority, patient, calculated, and designed to preserve stability without provoking unnecessary conflict. Marriage alliances proved particularly effective in maintaining influence. By linking the royal family to Norman nobility, Robert II created bonds that transcended politics and carried moral weight. Familial ties not only encouraged loyalty, but also provided mechanisms for the crown to intervene in succession disputes or disputes over vassals. These networks of kinship became long-term tools of governance, allowing the Capetians to influence powerful neighbors indirectly. In the years following Robert's reign, the legacy of these alliances would continue to shape interactions between the French crown and Normandy, highlighting the enduring impact of personal and familial diplomacy. Ecclesiastical support reinforced this stability. Monks, abbots, and bishops acted as trusted intermediaries between the Capetians and Norman leaders, legitimizing agreements, confirming oaths of fealty, and mediating disputes. The Church's authority provided a framework within which both secular and spiritual obligations intersected, creating a shared understanding of justice, loyalty, and legitimacy. By integrating ecclesiastical influence into the management of external relations, the Capetians strengthened their position while avoiding the pitfalls of direct military confrontation. Selective military action was used strategically to reinforce authority without destabilizing the fragile balance. Skirmishes, shows of force, and limited campaigns served as reminders of the crown's capacity to intervene when necessary. Yet Robert II avoided large-scale confrontation with Normandy, understanding that open conflict could provoke rebellion or undermine the intricate networks of alliances he had cultivated. The careful calibration of force, combined with diplomacy and patronage, exemplifies the Capetians' preference for pragmatic, incremental strategies over dramatic or risky military adventures. Economic and trade relationships also played a subtle but important role. Normandy's control of ports, markets, and maritime routes made it both strategically valuable and politically significant. By engaging in mutually beneficial arrangements supporting trade, confirming toll rights, and facilitating commerce, the Capetians intertwined their interests with those of the duchy. Economic interdependence became another layer of influence, reinforcing loyalty and cooperation without overt coercion. By the conclusion of Robert II's reign, the Capetians had achieved a delicate stability in their relations with Normandy. The duchy remained powerful and autonomous, yet the crown had successfully established mechanisms to project influence, mediate disputes, and encourage cooperation. This balance relied on constant vigilance, adaptability, and a combination of soft power and selective hard power, a model that would guide Capetian interactions with other regions for generations. Reflecting on the broader significance, the Capetians' handling of Normandy demonstrates a key principle of early medieval governance. Authority is often maintained not through domination, but through the careful management of relationships, obligations, and perception. Diplomacy, marriage, ecclesiastical patronage, and selective military intervention together created a durable framework for influence, allowing the monarchy to navigate a fragmented political landscape. Yet the question remained for future kings. Could this equilibrium endure in the face of shifting ambitions, external pressures, and the unpredictable nature of succession? Normandy would continue to loom as both an opportunity and a test of Capetian skill, illustrating the persistent challenges of ruling a decentralized kingdom. Story 7. The Capetians and the Nobility, Vassals, Loyalty, and Rebellion. In the early 11th century, the Capetian kings faced a constant challenge: the French nobility. The kingdom was highly decentralized, with counts, dukes, viscounts, and barons controlling lands, armies, and justice largely independently of the crown. The loyalty of these nobles was often conditional, based on personal relationships, marriage ties, and local interests rather than institutionalized obligations. For a relatively weak monarchy like the Capetians, governing a realm where authority was both personal and dispersed required a delicate balance of negotiation, coercion, and strategic patronage. At the heart of Capetian strategy was the careful management of vassal relationships. Vassals owed allegiance to the king, but this was rarely unconditional or permanent. Oaths of fealty were supplemented with gifts, land grants, and recognition of privileges, creating a network of obligations that bound nobles to the crown while respecting their autonomy. Failure to manage these relationships could result in rebellion, as nobles often seized opportunities to assert their independence when the king appeared weak or distracted. Robert II inherited this challenge from Hugh Capet. The monarchy's authority was strongest in the Ile-de-France, but beyond the heartland, local lords operated with considerable autonomy. Some nobles respected royal authority, seeing it as a source of legitimacy and protection, while others tested the crown's limits, exploiting disputes over inheritance, succession, or territory. The king's role was less that of an absolute ruler and more that of an arbiter and strategist, mediating disputes, rewarding loyalty, and carefully calibrating displays of power to maintain equilibrium. Marriage was a critical tool for managing these relationships. Robert II and his close relatives were married into influential families across the kingdom, weaving bonds of loyalty that extended beyond immediate political needs. These unions linked the crown to powerful vassals in both personal and political terms, providing leverage in times of dispute and ensuring that nobles had a stake in the stability of the monarchy. The careful orchestration of these alliances required attention to both local power dynamics and broader strategic goals, illustrating the Capetians' patient and long-term approach to governance. Beyond kinship, religious institutions reinforced the king's influence over nobles. Bishops and abbots acted as mediators in disputes, lent moral authority to agreements, and occasionally pressured reluctant vassals to honor their obligations. By integrating ecclesiastical power into governance, the Capetians strengthened the perception of legitimacy and created channels for indirect influence. Clerical endorsement could validate royal authority, making it more difficult for nobles to defy the crown without moral or social repercussions. Yet the fragility of this system was ever present. Rebellions, disputes over succession, and contested inheritance were constant threats. Even a single influential noble could destabilize a region if dissatisfied with royal decisions. The Capetians mitigated these risks through diplomacy, selective force, and careful attention to local customs and expectations. Rewards for loyalty and punishments for defiance were carefully calibrated to maintain balance without provoking widespread unrest. The monarchy's survival depended on its ability to act as both negotiator and enforcer, recognizing the limits of direct authority while exploiting opportunities to extend influence. Economic and territorial control reinforced these strategies. The crown's administration of tolls, markets, and royal estates provided resources to reward loyal vassals or fund interventions when disputes arose. Wealth became a tool of influence, complementing marriage alliances, patronage, and ecclesiastical support. By demonstrating competence and fairness in managing these resources, the Capetians reinforced their moral and practical authority, encouraging nobles to recognize royal oversight even in a decentralized kingdom. By the end of Section 1, it is clear that Capetian rule depended on the delicate management of a fragmented nobility. Authority was maintained not through absolute control, but through negotiation, patronage, marriage, and moral influence. Nobles were powerful actors whose loyalty was contingent and often fluid, requiring constant attention from the crown. The question remained, could the Capetians maintain the fragile web of allegiance across generations, or would the ambitions of vassals eventually undermine the monarchy's stability? The early French kings had established the groundwork, but the dynamics of loyalty and rebellion would continue to test their governance for decades to come. During Robert II's reign, the French nobility remained a double-edged sword, indispensable for administration and military support, yet potentially destabilizing when ambition or resentment surfaced. The king's authority was strongest in the Île-de-France, but as he sought to extend influence into surrounding regions, he frequently encountered resistance from powerful vassals who valued autonomy over obedience. Managing these nobles required a combination of diplomacy, strategic concessions, and the careful use of force. Rebellions were a persistent reality. Disputes over succession, inheritance, and feudal obligations often ignited conflicts that tested the monarchy's patience and resources. For example, certain counts challenged the crown's right to mediate local disputes, while others resisted taxation or royal oversight of their lands. In these cases, Robert II relied first on negotiation, using emissaries, mediators, and intermediaries, often clerics, to resolve tensions before they escalated into open warfare. Letters, oaths, and public rituals of reconciliation played a critical role in signaling the restoration of loyalty and the crown's moral authority. Marriage alliances served as a preventive tool against rebellion. By marrying his children and close relatives into influential families, Robert created vested interests among powerful nobles in maintaining the monarchy's stability. These alliances extended influence into regions where royal authority was weak, ensuring that even potentially rebellious lords had personal or familial reasons to cooperate. In some instances, marriage allowed disputes over inheritance or succession to be settled without force, demonstrating the subtle power of kinship in reinforcing loyalty. Ecclesiastical intervention often complemented these strategies. Bishops and abbots acted as neutral arbiters, mediating conflicts and legitimizing royal decisions. Their authority carried moral weight, providing a persuasive incentive for nobles to comply with the crown. In some cases, ecclesiastical endorsement was sufficient to end disputes that might otherwise have resulted in prolonged conflict. By integrating the church into governance, the Capetians created both a stabilizing influence and a visible demonstration of moral legitimacy. When negotiation and mediation failed, Robert II could exercise selective force. Limited military campaigns or the mobilization of loyal vassals served to remind ambitious nobles of the crown's authority. These interventions were deliberately calculated. Full-scale war was avoided whenever possible, as prolonged conflict could weaken royal influence and embolden other lords. The careful application of force, combined with diplomacy and marriage alliances, reflected the Capetians' preference for pragmatic, incremental reinforcement of authority rather than direct confrontation. Economic and territorial incentives also reinforced loyalty. Land grants, recognition of privileges, and access to royal resources provided tangible rewards for cooperation. Similarly, sanctions such as temporary forfeiture of estates or fines served as reminders of the consequences of disloyalty. By calibrating rewards and punishments carefully, the monarchy created a system in which obedience was encouraged and rebellion discouraged, even in regions where direct enforcement was difficult. This intricate balance extended to the management of feudal obligations. The king relied on written charters and oaths of fealty to formalize relationships with his vassals. These documents, often preserved by clerics, served as enduring evidence of loyalty and obligation. They also reinforced the perception that royal authority was legitimate, contractual, and morally sanctioned, strengthening the crown's position even in areas where physical power was limited. Despite these measures, the Capetians' grip on the nobility remained delicate. Ambition, resentment, and local power dynamics constantly tested the monarchy. A single misstep delayed response to a dispute, perceived favoritism, or mismanaged alliance could trigger unrest. Robert II's reign demonstrates that governing a fragmented kingdom required constant vigilance, nuanced negotiation, and the ability to integrate multiple levers of influence: kinship, faith, economic incentives, and military capability into a coherent strategy. By the end of Section 2, it is evident that Capetian rule over the nobility relied on subtlety, patience, and long-term thinking. Loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be cultivated, maintained, and occasionally enforced. The monarchy's survival depended on managing the ambitions of powerful nobles while gradually reinforcing the crown's moral, economic, and political authority. Yet the question remained: could this delicate system endure over successive generations, or would accumulated tensions eventually erupt into broader conflict? The interplay between the Capetians and their vassals set the stage for both the dynasty's consolidation and the recurring challenges of medieval French governance. By the end of Robert II's reign, the Capetians had established a cautious but effective system for managing their powerful and often unpredictable nobility. The monarchy's authority was far from absolute, yet through careful negotiation, strategic marriages, ecclesiastical intervention, selective enforcement, and economic incentives, the kings had created a framework that allowed the crown to survive and even gradually extend influence across a fragmented kingdom. One of the most enduring strategies was the cultivation of loyalty through kinship. Marriage alliances linked the royal family to influential noble houses, creating personal and familial obligations that reinforced political allegiance. These ties proved crucial in resolving disputes without recourse to violence, mitigating potential rebellions, and ensuring that nobles had a vested interest in the stability of the monarchy. By weaving loyalty into the social fabric, the Capetians secured a measure of influence that extended beyond the immediate reach of their armies or administration. Ecclesiastical support remained a stabilizing force. Bishops, abbots, and other clerics acted as mediators, legitimizers, and moral authorities, reinforcing the crown's decisions and providing avenues for dispute resolution. By aligning with the church, the Capetians added a moral dimension to authority that could persuade reluctant nobles and legitimize royal intervention. The integration of spiritual and secular power allowed the monarchy to maintain credibility and moral standing, even when direct enforcement was limited. Selective displays of military power complemented these approaches. While the Capetians rarely engaged in large-scale conflict with their own vassals, limited campaigns or shows of force demonstrated the crown's capacity to act when necessary. These interventions were strategic, measured, and carefully targeted to reinforce authority without provoking widespread rebellion. The combination of diplomacy, familial alliances, and calculated enforcement exemplified the Capetians' preference for incremental, sustainable consolidation over dramatic or risky confrontations. Economic and territorial incentives also reinforced loyalty. Grants of land, recognition of privileges, access to markets, and control of tolls provided tangible rewards for obedience and cooperation. Conversely, temporary sanctions for disloyalty served as reminders of the consequences of defiance. By calibrating incentives and penalties carefully, the monarchy encouraged nobles to honor their obligations, creating a delicate balance that minimized open rebellion while reinforcing the crown's influence. Despite these strategies, the monarchy's control remained fragile. Powerful vassals continued to exercise considerable autonomy, and the loyalty of even close allies could be conditional or temporary. Rebellion, disputes over inheritance,